Buonasera anche alle persone che sono nelle altre
Good evening,
due
ladies
sale.
and gentlemen. Welcome to the people in the rooms nearby. And my apologies for those who could not enter the building. There are screens in the Piazza Duomo and in other parts of the city, so people will have the opportunity to follow this lecture directly, which is the one opening up the festival. The lecture by Amartya Sen, which we heard 1 week ago, the one which inaugurated the festival, which will also continue in these 3 days in Trento and Rovereto. Amartya Sen stressed that a large part of the economic thinking, in a way, has neglected the link between markets and freedoms. In particular, freedom intended not only as nominal freedom of choice, but as an effective, real freedom. For example, an unemployed person might decide to have a job, but if they don't find a job, they won't be able to make that choice. Sen stressed that the large majority of economic thinking dealt with the relationship between market and well-being, but not deepening enough the link between market and freedom. Dani RODRIK, the scholar we have here tonight, who will illustrate his ideas, is one of the scholars who most contributed in analyzing the relationship between market and institutions which are there to redistribute proceedings. One of the limits to the exercise of freedom is the fact that the relationship between market and well-being often so neglects the distribution of revenues and of wealth. So, in the opening of markets, there are important effects on the distribution of wealth. This is the reason why there are institutions which are an infrastructure for the functioning of the market, which are also there to remedy for problems in the redistribution or the unfair distribution of wealth. They are there to limit the differences caused by the markets. Dani RODRIK wrote important books concerning the relationship between opening up of markets, globalization, internationalization, opening up to trade, redistribution. He stressed that it is extremely important to have institutions redistributing wealth or guaranteeing social protection and fairness, in particular in the field of liberalization of trade. The markets are never alone. They need institutions. Still, we have a problem. Institutions can only be set up following collective decisions or collective mechanisms of decision-making which go beyond the choices of individuals. We have democracies, we have decision-making processes to set up such institutions. Today, in the light of the different jurisdictions, the power of those who make choices for the community, there is a prevalence for national dimension. There are many processes and many phenomena today which indeed go well beyond national borders. So there is a tension underlying between the collective choices and the national institutions and phenomena connected with globalization which really go beyond national borders. So we are very glad to have Dani RODRIK here lecturing on this subject. There is a need to create forms to coordinate the decisions of different countries in order to be able to govern the processes which are happening on a global scale. Dani RODRIK is a professor of the Kennedy School of Government. In 2007, he received a very important award for his work in the field of economics, political sciences, social sciences, the Wishman Prize. He has a really impressive resume. He is just older 1 year. I am younger by 1 year, but indeed he wrote a lot. We have software to check the impact and the amount of scientific publications. It's called Publish or Perish. And we check the amount of work that colleagues do. So if you write Dani RODRIK, the software sort of gets jammed, and we have a message because he has more than 1,000 publications listed, and they are mentioned many times in the Google score. So indeed, these are internationally reviewed journals. It's very difficult to have one's article published there. So indeed, that's a sign of a major impact in the field. His indeed the most quoted book is Has Globalization Gone Too Far, of 1997, a book which was quoted by Businessweek and put in the list of the 10 most influential books of that decade. Tonight he is here maybe to speak about the next step in his thinking. The Future of Globalization is the title. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Tito, for that very gracious introduction, for your invitation. It's wonderful to be in this great town, in this beautiful hall, talking about some of the most burning problems of our day. I will try to give you an overview of some of the ideas in my new book, which has just been translated into Italian, has been in the bookstores, I guess, in Italy for now about a week or so, and try to relate some of these issues to both how we think about the crisis in which the European Union finds itself in, and what it says about the future of globalization. Of course, my title, The Future of Globalization, is a teaser. I have no idea about the future of globalization. Maybe I should stop here and give those of you who want to leave at this point the chance to do so. But in any case, anytime an economist talks to you and promises to tell you something about what the future will look like, that is a good time to leave the room. We have an absolutely terrible record. I think it was John Kenneth Galbraith that said that economic forecasters exist to give astrologers a good name, and I'm not sure, in light of the last few years, whether in fact it may not be the other way around. I am known as a critic of globalization, but what I'm going to try to do here is not suggest that globalization is a bad thing, not going to suggest that we should resist globalization. I'm going to try to suggest that globalization and capitalism, which is very closely allied to it, is a set of institutions that is in fact quite malleable, quite variable, and it is in our hands to construct a different narrative, a new set of understandings, a new conception about what globalization ought to be, and what an appropriate form of capitalism for the present century would look like. And it's towards the creation of this new narrative, this new storyline about what globalization ought to be, is towards that I want to present a few ideas. But first, let me go a little back to suggest how we got here, and in particular, how our ideas about capitalism, market systems, globalization has evolved over time, just to give you a sense that of what I mean when I say that capitalism is something that is highly malleable, highly flexible. We've had several versions, and I'll give you a very capsule summary of our changing conceptions of capitalism. The earliest intellectual construction of capitalism, what I call version 1.0, is an idea that goes back to Adam Smith. And Adam Smith's central insight was that the market system and competition are the most dynamic form of an economic engine that we could think of, and that markets and competition were a source of generating wealth and material well-being. And the simple and to this day textbook renditions of the way that a market economy or a capitalist market economy works presumed that a market economy really requires a very minimal state, a very minimal set of governance arrangements for the market. In particular, the way that Adam Smith put it, you need, of course, the state to provide for national defense. You need the state to provide for a system of protection of property rights so that capitalism can exist. And of course, you need minimal administration of justice. And those are the three things that the state really requires. Now, Adam Smith, in fact, had a much more expansive view of the functions of the state, which you get if you read his other work, and not just The Wealth of Nations. But this minimal view, this very thin understanding of what the market system required, is still the residue of the Smithian system and the textbook version of the market economy that we have inherited from that initial version 1.0 of capitalism. This, in practice, this view of this version of capitalism was the view that underlay the 19th century conduct of economic policy, where in fact the state had very limited functions, collected very little revenue, and didn't have an understanding of conducting macroeconomic policy or providing a lot of any social protection. It also is the foundation of today's libertarian vision. Libertarianism is a current of thought that still remains quite strong in the United States, and attaches a very, very minimal function to what the role of the government ought to be. And the basic idea is that the government should do the absolute minimum, just get out of the way, and markets will take care of themselves. In particular, they will take care of all of our needs at the same time. This is this early version of capitalism was eventually succeeded by a more elaborate version, what I call version 2.0. The central insight of this version focused on the limitations of markets and what, in fact, markets required in order to perform all the advertised benefits. And this was based on an understanding that markets need a whole range of additional non-market institutions and non-markets mechanisms of governance in order to work well, in order to become sustainable, in order to be viewed legitimized. So markets in that way aren't self-creating. You need not just property rights, but also a wide range of contract enforcement institutions, wide range of judicial institutions to enforce contracts. As we have increasingly understood, they are not self-regulating in the sense that you need rules and regulations to ensure that employers don't cheat their workers, banks don't cheat their borrowers, that firms and producers don't cheat their customers, and that countries have the productive structure to generate sort of new industries and move into new industries that markets don't necessarily generate on their own. So you need a whole set of regulatory institutions. And of course, as Keynes has taught us, markets are also not self-stabilizing. They need monetary and fiscal institutions to ensure that they generate adequate levels of employment, that the business cycle is moderated. And ultimately, markets aren't self-legitimizing because the economic outcomes that they generate may not always be consistent with the values, the norms, the customs of a broader social and political community. So you need mechanisms of safety nets, social protection, and ultimately, of course, political democracy as well as an institution that legitimizes markets, because ultimately people know that they have the power and the voice to generate the rules that can influence the way or moderate the ways in which markets produce. That is why the evolution of capitalism in the 20th century, in particular after the Second World War, has been a history of a wide range of institutions, regulatory institutions, redistributive institutions, monetary and fiscal institutions, and institutions of social and political conflict management, which have been the complement of the development of markets and which have been necessary to legitimize markets. And essentially, one way of understanding how is it that the socialist revolution, the communist revolution, never came to pass is that capitalism reinvented itself in this version 2.0. It learned to regulate itself. It learned to embed itself in these broader social and political institutions. In practice, in the way that this was practiced in the advanced countries of the world, it was a combination of Keynes and the welfare state. Keynes in terms of macroeconomic policy, stabilization policy, and the welfare state to provide for the social protections. And in the newly industrializing countries of the developing world, there was a third set of interventions, and those were, of course, import substitution policies or industrial policies to restructure their economies, to overcome market imperfections of another kind in the productive sphere. Now, this capitalism, version 2.0, was a national system of capitalism, not a global one. In fact, Keynes, who was one of the architects of the post-Second World War global economic system, the so-called Bretton Woods regime, understood very well that in order for what today we call Keynesianism, Keynesian economic policies, Keynesian moderation of the business cycle, Keynesian interventions, it was very important that the economic system not be thoroughly globalized. And in particular, it was very important that there be controls on the flow of capital across the world, because he understood that if you put all these countries in a globally integrated, financially globalized world, given the ease with which money can flow in and out of countries, and the constraints that that would place on the conduct of macroeconomic policies, that the kind of policy that he advocated, Keynesianism, would be incompatible with that kind of a system. So famously, Keynes said that we need capital controls, not just as a temporary expedient until the post-war reconstruction is completed, but as a permanent element of this new regime. Similarly, in the area of trade relations, even though the GATT regime, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, undertook and was successful in generating significant amount of trade liberalization, by today's standards, it is interesting how unambitious the GATT system was in terms of how far it pushed globalization in trade. Because, of course, we had whole areas of world trade left out of the GATT. Services wasn't included, agriculture wasn't included, developing countries weren't included, they could do whatever they wanted. So it was, the rules applied only for manufacturers trade for the advanced countries, and even for those countries, when certain large sectors got under pressure that conflicted with prevailing social and political bargains, those sectors were taken out of the rules, such as textiles and clothing being the most famous example in the context of the so-called multi-fiber arrangement. So this system, the capitalism version 2.0, was a national system of capitalism. It existed within a very thin regime of global rules. And that left, by purpose, because that was the whole idea of the Bretton Woods regime, left significant room for maneuver for domestic policymakers, policy space, an idea that I'll come back to later. Now, for various reasons, the post-war Bretton Woods compromise evaporated. It was partly because, as the regime was successful, some of the main lessons were forgotten, and improvements in communication and other technologies sort of furthered a capital mobility. So part of it was increased capital mobility, part of it was a new way of thinking about the relationship between markets and society, something that developed during the 1980s, something that is sometimes called neoliberalism or market fundamentalism, that basically threw away the older understanding and started to push for what I call in this book hyper-globalization, which is sort of an attempt to attain this textbook understanding of economic globalization, where there is no difference between domestic markets and international markets, that national borders make no difference whatsoever. And this push for hyperglobalization was an attempt to basically do away with any regulations that imposed costs on trade and financial integration at the border. So these were not just measures at the border like tariffs or restrictions on flows of capital across borders, but also any kind of domestic regulations in different areas that might be viewed as increasing the cost of doing business internationally and therefore became a potential targets. There were two elements to this push for hyperglobalization. One was the World Trade Organization, which was much more ambitious, much more expansive in terms of how much it wanted to push the trade liberalization frontier, and also how much it went beyond the border into trying to harmonize and regulate rules in terms of patent rules, copyright rules, industrial policy rules, subsidies, health and safety rules, to the extent that they might impose barriers to international trade and investment. And on the other side, it was financial liberalization, financial globalization, the idea that, quite contrary to what Keynes had said, that the new norm, the new orthodoxy became that the flow of capital, the flow of financial assets ought to be free rather than restricted. I think there was at least two blind spots that led to this push. One was that one could push for this hyperglobalization and worry about the institutional underpinnings to catch up later. So people who pushed, for example, for financial globalization, for free capital mobility, were often aware that in order for that system to work, you needed significant amount of regulatory apparatus, significant amount of new macroeconomic tools and regulations to come into play. But even though those regulations and tools lagged behind the increase in capital mobility, the general response was, well, it's not capital mobility we should restrict, it's just that we should make sure that those institutions and regulations come into being. The second blind spot was that this increased attempt to integrate markets would have either no or mostly benign effects on national institutional arrangements and therefore on the working of national democracies. So workers and others who were concerned about the problem of an unlevel playing field, unfair trade, which they thought of, how can we compete with people when they are when companies employ workers under labor standards, let's say, that differ significantly from ours? Or how can we compete when governments are subsidizing their industries elsewhere? How can we compete with firms that are ravaging the environment? So this kind of plausible concern about the lack of level playing field, which, by the way, in a domestic setting doesn't exist, because in domestic setting, commerce exists within a uniform set of institutions, but becomes an important issue in an international setting, because international setting, you're now trading across jurisdictions with different sets of rules, that these kinds of concerns weren't of importance, that they were simply another form of expression of the principle of comparative advantage, that one shouldn't worry about things like corporate tax competition, that firms lobbying their governments to reduce the corporate taxes because otherwise they would leave, go somewhere else. The idea being that this was a good thing. By reducing corporate taxes, you would have more efficiency and so forth. So it's somewhat a view that the net effect of all of these things in terms of what it did to domestic arrangements, domestic regulations, and the way that domestic democracy worked was, on the whole, not either of minimal consequence or not very harmful. I think many of the problems of the existing model of globalization are directly the result of that overreaching. One direct result, of course, is that we have created a world trading regime which lacks complete legitimacy. The World Trade Organization, which for economists is one of the crowning institutional achievements of the last 30 years, is probably the world's least popular organization if you ask the person on the street. The general sense, and not a very implausible one at that, is that the chain of delegation, which goes from the domestic electorate to a bunch of judges in Geneva, that chain of delegation is way too long and not entirely consistent with our understanding of how a democracy or how democratic accountable decision-making ought to function. So one key problem, particularly faced by the trade regime, has been the lack of legitimacy of the system. The problem in financial globalization has been rather that we have not managed to create something like the World Trade Organization that is the equivalent in the financial globalization arena. But what that has meant, of course, is that we have ended up with inadequate regulation and rules, and therefore instability, inefficiency, and a series of periodic crises in finance arising from inadequate regulation globally and inadequate regulation domestically. The most recent of which was, of course, the financial crisis that emanated from the United States and spread to other countries after 2008. And with respect to developing countries, we had a very interesting development that the period since 1980 was a tremendous success in terms of many countries, including most significantly, of course, China and a few other countries in East and Southeast Asia. The period since 1980 has been clearly a period of unparalleled poverty reduction in the world. But the paradox here was that the countries that were the most successful in this period in developing and managing poverty reduction, countries like China, Vietnam, and a few others, were successful precisely because they played the globalization game not by the post-1980 hyper-globalization rules, but they played the game by the Bretton Woods rules, by the earlier rules. As the Chinese like to say, we want to keep the window open, but not forget the mosquito net. So this way you get the fresh air, but you can keep the bugs out. And China's approach to globalization has been very similar. They have not liberalized their trade until they could restructure their economy. They joined the World Trade Organization very late, until their trade and industrial policies had had a huge amount of effect on creating the industrial base upon which they could build their globalization success. Of course, they have managed and continue to manage capital flows. They manage their exchange rate. So it has been this heavy management which is incompatible with our existing post-1980 or post-1990 version of globalization, which actually lies at the root of the success of these countries. So the fundamental problem of the world economy today is this imbalance between the reach of markets straining to become global, and the scope of their governance. The governance remains mostly national. So the question that becomes the question about the future of globalization is what will capitalism, this global version of capitalism 3.0, look like? The temptation is to say, well, since capitalism 2.0 was one where institutions were nationally based, but now markets have become global, the temptation is to say that this new version of capitalism should be one where we take our domestic institutions, our national institutions, our domestic mechanisms of governance, and simply globalize those as well, along with global markets. So we talk about global governance, and global governance in a real sense, not a thin layer of global governance, but real global governance in the sense that we have national governance that governs national markets, global governance to govern global markets. So that means truly global regulation, truly global standards, truly global safety nets, truly global macroeconomic management, and so forth. But of course, as soon as I say it, you say, well, this is impractical, and it is, because it places too much faith on the willingness of countries to give up national sovereignty. But I think the more important substantive argument against this conception of our next phase of globalization is that it is also undesirable. So my argument against this idea of global governance as the solution to our economic problems is not just that it's impractical, that policymakers will never give up on national sovereignty, but it is a deeper reason that is also not desirable. It's not desirable because democracy as a way of organizing our affairs remains national, that the principal legitimate locus of democratic deliberation remains the nation states. And that is why we have a legitimate need for diversity in the types of regulation and the types of institutional infrastructure that markets take. So this diversity in national preferences and needs, which are expressed through national democratic deliberative mechanisms, is not just an inconvenience. it's a desirable part of how we have arranged our broader life in terms of the way that we exercise voice and exercise our political rights. So the question becomes, if different countries have different preferences, for example, if France wants a little bit more financial stability at the expense of less financial innovation, and therefore wants perhaps greater regulation of derivatives than the United States views as appropriate, because the United States may value financial innovation more than financial stability, shouldn't France or the European Union have different rules on derivatives than the United States? And if, of course, they do, then it's going to be impossible to talk about a unified world market in swaps and other kinds of derivatives. Similarly, if developing countries have very different policy needs in terms of industrial policies, restructuring policies, to carry out structural transformation and diversifying their economies because they're at a much lower level of development earlier in the stage of development, is it appropriate necessarily to pigeonhole them with other countries that may not have similar needs and force on them the same kinds of restrictions on their policies, on their industrial policies and subsidies that may not be as appropriate? Now, of course, the European Union is an exception that in many ways we're learning proves the rule. Because the European Union, at least one conception of the European Union, was that what Europe was trying to do was try to construct a regional version of what I've called global governance. The idea was that if we are going to have a truly unified single market in Europe, that needed to be embedded in Europe-wide institutions, and we got a fair number of those institutions. We got the European Parliament, we got the European Commission, the European Court of Justice, which has been very important in enforcing the single market. We have this ongoing process of legislation, the acquis communautaire, which no one knows how many pages it is now, but you know, sort of everybody agrees it's more than 100,000 pages. And of course, some of the European countries have gone even further in creating a unified monetary zone, and the European Central Bank. But what the crisis has taught us is that despite all this institution building, which has gone much farther than what we experienced in the rest of the world, that even that was insufficient. That Eurozone needed, in order to sustain a common monetary area, a common financial system, common monetary policy, also needed a common fiscal policy. So they needed a fiscal union. That regulations in financial markets had to also have been harmonized. But those weren't done, I think, for the simple reason that it was much easier to transfer monetary policy to a union-level organization because that was viewed as largely a technocratic decision. It could be delegated to a bunch of technocratic central bankers, the ECB. But the moment you start talking about the regulation, the moment you talk about fiscal policy, these are issues with much greater political import, and it becomes much harder to agree on what the common rules are going to be. It becomes much harder to agree that you are going to delegate these to truly European institutions, and therefore these remain at best taken care of in an intergovernmental fashion, where the national governments, individual member states still retain prerogatives still are the ones that are carrying out these policies and not a union-wide institution. The best way to actually see how incomplete the institution building and the building of a political union in Europe has been is to compare Europe to the United States, because the United States, after all, is a collection of individual states. And the United States went through a very similar debate and similar period of integration. The United States didn't start out as a single political federal entity. The whole debate in the Constitutional Convention of 1787 in the United States was whether the United States would remain a confederacy where each individual state retained significant sovereign powers, or where, in fact, they were going to, these states would give up powers to a federal government in Washington, D.C., and ultimately it was the Federalists that won. But it took a whole century and ultimately a civil war for that gain, for that decision to have actually turned into practical reality for the United States to become a truly federal entity. So this is just to say that when we complain about the lack of institutions in Europe, we have to understand that historically this is a process that takes a very long time, and we shouldn't be too harsh on European policymakers for not having been able to complete this integration process, the institutional and political aspects of this, judging from the American example. But, and in a way, the misfortune of Europe was having been caught in this crisis, which wasn't their doing, which came from the United States, midway in this process of institution building and institutional integration. But what we see in the United States is precisely what Europe today lacks. If California has a large budget deficit, if the state of California has a very large budget deficit and therefore looks like it might be insolvent, it might be bankrupt, what happens? Well, California shares a common currency with the rest of the United States, just like Greece and Portugal and Ireland do. But when the state of California becomes insolvent, Californians, individual Californians, are automatically getting welfare payments, checks, transfers, reduced taxes from the federal system. So there is an immediate system of transfers, of safety nets that come from the Union. Yeah? Nothing like this exists in the European Union. Just because the state of California is bankrupt doesn't mean that individual borrowers in California get shut out of credit markets either. As long as, if you're a bank in California, if you have a good balance sheet, you can continue to borrow in American credit markets, even though the government of California is bankrupt. Look at Greece today. Just because the Greek government is bankrupt, no Greek bank can borrow. Why? Well, because it is viewed, there's something called country risk, sovereign risk. Greece is still viewed as sufficiently sovereign, whereas California isn't. And therefore, the fact that the Greek government is insolvent means no other borrower in Greece can access markets at the same time. Of course, in the United States, we have a Federal Reserve that automatically provides for lender of last resort, not through a series of ad hoc and highly contentious negotiations. Californian interests are represented directly in Washington in the federal political institutions. Californians can easily move and job seek elsewhere in the United States without facing language barriers or without facing culture shock. Effectively, the quid pro quo in the United States from the perspective of California versus the federal government is that California, the state of California, has given up its sovereignty and has accepted the reach of federal laws and regulations and has accepted the limitation that it can never overcome those laws and regulations. Of course, in return, Californian residents are given political representation, so they actually can stand up for their interests in the common monetary policy, in the common fiscal policy, in the common regulatory policies. So because this is not how the Eurozone system works, the crisis within the Eurozone is more costly, both in economic terms, because you don't have these various mechanisms of assisting parts of the Union that are in trouble, but also becomes more costly for political terms, in political terms, because the process of negotiating what's going to happen becomes highly contentious. And therefore you have the Northerners and the Germans complaining about the Greek profligacy and why should Germans bail out the Greeks who had overspent, and the Greeks complaining about how selfish the Germans are and simply bailing out their own banks. We can see the central point that I'm making in terms of the necessary complementarity between broader institutions, including political institutions, and single integrated markets, is we can see it precisely in the dilemma that the European Union faces today. Because if the European Union is going to get out of this crisis, I think it has to make a decision. The decision is either it decides to become more of a political union, and that's because it has to federalize fiscal policy, and it cannot federalize fiscal policy without, in some sense, building a political community at the same time. Or if it is unwilling to do that, if it's unable or unwilling to achieve political integration, that it is going to have to accept less economic union. In other words, allow Greece and the others to actually have the policy instruments that they need in order to reactivate their economies. I will finish by returning back to some of the global issues and summarize my argument by way of a number of general guidelines. The first point is to really drive home the point again that markets need to be deeply embedded in systems of governance in order to work well. Second, that these institutions of governance, particularly democratic governance and political communities today, are organized largely within nation states, and they are likely to remain so in the immediate future. Potentially, the European Union could be an exception, but as we're observing today, and as my discussion makes clear, even there is a big question mark. Third, that there is no one way in the sense of how we design these arguments, these mechanisms of regulation, that the institutional designs that underpin market economies will differ according to the democratic preferences of different jurisdictions. That countries, democratic countries in particular, have the right to protect their own social arrangements and institutions, but not the right to impose them on others. So this is an important distinction, that if you want to protect your set of financial market regulations, your labor market institutions, your safety nets, and if that requires some impediments to the free flow of goods and services, that is okay. But what is less okay is to say that to impose on other countries your labor market institutions, your financial market regulations. And this implies, in turn, is that we need to push for a system of international economic governance that is significantly less ambitious, significantly falls short from the global governance ideal, and creates policy space for democracies, for the advanced democracies, so that they can recreate their own domestic social and political bargains, for the developing countries to have the space to undertake the kinds of policies that are needed to restructure their economies and diversify their economies. And I've emphasized that the importance, the normative value of creating this policy space because of the presumption that the constituent units are democratic, that the policy outputs are therefore normatively desirable, normatively have value. Of course, not all countries are democratic, and therefore would need to think about a second set of considerations about how do we deal with non-democratic countries. I'm not going to go into the detail of that, but simply say that in non-democratic countries, since we cannot presume that their choices reflect the needs of their citizenry, that it would be not undesirable to subject those countries to less permissive rules in terms of how much policy space are required. So, what is the future of globalization? I have no idea. But I do know that if we go on our current path, where we simply presume that we can build these global institutions, these global governance mechanisms, as implausible and undesirable as that path might be, that we are going to be once again finding ourselves in exactly the same set of problems that we have created, namely this dangerous imbalance between the reach of markets and the scope of the governance. And we have to figure out a way of bringing those two much more closely aligned to each other. And unfortunately, there is no way of doing that except for reducing our ambitions on how much globalization we can have. So the paradox of globalization is that sometimes less is more. Thank you very much.
Grazie Dani per questa visione.
Thank you very much, Dani, for sharing your thoughts. So thank you very much. Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts with us, and thank you very much for highlighting the problems concerning the European Union and speaking about the very difficult choices that Europe will have to make, in particular concerning the steps to be made to integrate, to face the public debt crisis. Now we have time for some questions from the audience. There are some free chairs in the front line for the persons who have to attend other meetings. There are people sitting on the floor. Please come up here and feel comfortable. So we have time for some questions. Please ask short questions. We prefer questions over comments. Lucrezia Reiklin is one of the speakers on the issue of European Central Bank.
Cool. I found your intervention quite convincing. And in a way, it's hard to disagree that we need global governance. In particular, well, does it work? Okay. Oh, okay, fine. In particular, for the European mechanism and integration, I think actually your point is one of the points that I would like to make tomorrow when I talk about the ECB. But I have two questions. Well, first, I mean, you're talking about what happens in the case of non-democratic states. I would say, even in the case of democracy, we live in an imperfect democracy. And so it is not obvious that going first for monetary union or financial integration is a bad idea for the dynamic of the evolution of other institutions like fiscal integration, governance, and so on. And the second question is, why do you think that the nation is the obvious unit when we talk about the democratic process? And of course, if you don't talk about the nation you know, at a level more sort of granular level of disaggregation, then it would be quite different what you have to say.
No, great questions. On the first, you're absolutely right that democracies don't necessarily work perfectly, and for that reason, actually, I didn't have a chance to talk about this. But one area which I talk about in the book, which I think is important, is one area where there is significant value in global rules or regional rules is rules that actually enhance the functioning of democratic deliberation, enhance the quality of democratic deliberation at home. So you might view, for example, delegation of monetary policy making to an extra-national central bank as a sort of desirable kind of delegation, because it takes monetary policy making out of the hands of policy, and we know with all the time inconsistency problems and short-termism that monetary policy might be otherwise subject to. That's a good thing. We can extend that principle across a number of different areas. So, for example, we might say, globally enough, it would be perfectly desirable for World Trade Organization to have rules as to sort of how the trade policy making machinery in individual countries ought to satisfy certain normatively desirable standards like accountability, representativeness, adherence to scientific and economic knowledge and research and so forth. So those are all things that I would be good for. Those are where I think the external regime, the global regime or the regional regime, can make hugely important contributions. In the case of the European Union, I also agree with you in terms of the dynamics, and that's why, I mean, the difference between, let's say, just to make it very clear, between Marty Feldstein and my view was that Marty Feldstein said from day one that the Eurozone would never work, a common currency would never work. But I interpreted it like you, which said that this is a process. As long as there is in the back of this a conception that you're integrating at, sort of that this is not where the process stops, that this may be, there's a political conception behind it, that it might make sense. And it might still have made sense, I think, if the American crisis hadn't struck. So I agree with you. That's why I'm still not down on the process. I mean, I don't think ex ante would have said, I said that this was a bad thing. On the second question, which was the nation, I agree with that as well. I think often if you have, I think the nation state is a way of organizing. It's sort of like local public goods. So if you think that different communities have different preferences for the type of public goods they want, and if the nation states are broadly aligned with those preferences, then it's okay for each different community or nation to want to have their own kind of financial regulation, for example. And that would significantly undercut the argument for why there ought to be a regionally or globally harmonized. So the normative value in the nation state is to the extent that it reflects a mass of preferences that might be different from those elsewhere. But where that differences aren't huge, as presumably they may not be in Europe, hopefully, then there isn't any normative value that attaches to the nation state. Then the problem is, how do you construct a political community? Here you have a very big responsibility for people like Merkel, who, rather than sort of telling Germans the story that she's telling now, would be, at this point, if the political union is going to be root, is try to construct a political narrative about how this is the germ of a political union. So that would be the issue, but of course that's not how the discussion is being carried out today.
Altre domande? Mi raccomando, brevi.
Very short. I don't know much about economics, but I would be very interested in knowing what's your opinion about some major European countries being out of the monetary system. Let's take UK. From your point of view, how much sense does that make? Thank you.
I'll make a quick answer. I think the British had their reasons, which was that they have their sort of financial institutions and that they didn't want to be part of a set of common rules. I think that I think was probably a wise decision. I think the more relevant the question today is, should a country like Greece actually leave the Eurozone. And I think, unfortunately, there's going to become a point where, if it hasn't come already, that if the kind of vision of a truly political union, political European Union, isn't articulated, and the problem that Greece faces today isn't fiscalized throughout the European Union, that I think it leaves very little option for Greece but to exit the Eurozone and depreciate its currency, because otherwise this existing policy of austerity upon austerity is neither economically desirable nor politically sustainable. And unfortunately, that becomes really the only other alternative for Greece. And of course, if Greece is going to do it, there's going to be at least a few others who will have to be pushed down that path as well. And the only question there is whether, if we are going to go down that path, whether the exit of Greece is done unilaterally at the moment of crisis, or it's going to be done in a way that's negotiated and orderly.
You've been very harsh on the democratic credentials of the WTO, but what you said may apply to any international institutions from the United Nations downwards. So is this something that is signaling that you don't believe in the democratic credentials of any international institution?
No, I mean, again, as I said, I mean, first of all, the World Trade Organization is very different from the United Nations, because the World Trade Organization, just to give you a sense, is the only international organization that has ever made, for example, the United States change its policy. Think about that for a second. The United States is sort of obviously the world's greatest power, has never changed anything that it does because of any kind of international decision, and has had to change some of its regulatory policies because of WTO decisions. And of course, you know, what's true for the United States is true for other countries. So the WTO has a degree of enforcement power in practice, which is orders of magnitude different from any other international, except for there are a few international climate agreements and so forth that's separate. So in that sense, and that's why it's a big success, right? If you ask economists, what's the UN? It's nothing. But the WTO, you know, their decisions really make a difference. Now, why is it, you know, democratic and non-democratic? I would like to see the World Trade Organization move in the direction that I suggested, which was that it'll have much greater legitimacy to the extent that the rules of the WTO are geared at enhancing domestic democratic decision-making. So enhance the transparency and the evidence-based nature of domestic trade and industrial policies, rather than narrow the space for policy diversity and harmonize all policies. So I think there's been too much of the latter, too little of the former. And the more it is the second, I think the more problematic it becomes from the standpoint of democratic delegation.
So thank you very much for this talk. I enjoyed it. I think you didn't say enough in favor of globalization. I mean, obviously the costs are very apparent, and we have a lot of them staring in the face right now. The gains from trade, starting with manufactured goods, agricultural goods, moving to services, financial products, trade and assets, obviously the gains from globalization are declining. Could you comment on that a little bit? I mean, where do you come down? I mean, I know where you come from, but there must be some gains from going somewhere, and Europe has gained a lot from having more trade. There's no question about that, within and without.
I think there we really have to look at area by area. So, you know, in trade, in goods, in the 1950s, there were huge potential gains from trade liberalization because their system was so highly restricted that the kind of liberalization that took place in the 60s and 70s provided very significant benefits. But if you look at, you know, trade in most things, including even agriculture today, so if you ask the question, what are the prospective gains from completing the Doha round? They're about this big. You know, they're about 0.1% of global GDP. That's not where the gains are. So if you want to look for gains, of course, you want to look at other areas. So, as you know, of course, labor mobility would be a huge area where, like, the global labor regime is roughly where the world trade regime was in the 1950s. So if that's, if you wanted to get some gains, that's what you would want to work for, and that's where I think would be very desirable. Similarly, in financial, I think it's very difficult to make the case at this point that there would be no losses and significant benefits from a regime that is much tighter on cross-border flows. So I think there, in trade and finance, I think prospective gains are relatively small. There are lots of service areas, in particular labor services, where the gains are very large, where in fact I would want to see where the negotiations take place.
Dente.
Sorry. In your presentation, you said that if California will have a passive, USA can help her. But how can you think all the states, all the European states can give their sovereignty to an international organism and let them be controlled by him, like all the little states of USA will be done by the US?
Well, there are different models of quasi-federal regimes, and I wouldn't necessarily say that the US one is exactly the right one for the European Union, nor would I say that this is something that ought to take place tomorrow or next month or in 2 years. But this is what the logic is. I mean, today, Trichet said that, Europe needs a common finance minister. Fine, yes, it does, and it clearly does. But then, who's going to be to whom will the finance minister be accountable to? To Berlin? The moment you start thinking about what the political structure behind that is, then you have to think about some kind of a federal political structure. So yes, think about if you want to have a truly European Union cabinet, including a finance minister, then you may need to think about a European Parliament that has much, much more broader powers, and a European budget that significantly goes beyond the 1% that it is, and so forth. And exactly what forms of representation, how the election system and the system of federalism, I mean, these are all architectural questions that need discussion. But I think, yes, ultimately, that's the path. It's going to take a long time, but if that's going to be the path, and I think this is the only coherent way of sustaining the single market in Europe, including financial integration, I think it ought to be, that goal has to be articulated today, that's where we're heading.
Professor RODRIK, you said about the scope of the asymmetry between the scope of markets and the reach of governance. And based on your today's speech and based on your previous publications, I know that you're concerned not only about the scope of the governments, but also the type of the governance, who's going to be benefit from that government and who's not. And talking about international trade, which is a major interest of mine, and given the stalemate in the WTO negotiations, namely the Doha round, and the proliferation of these bilateral trade agreements. So these bilateral trade agreements who are believed to be not in the favor of developing countries, and they're actually establishing some kind of mini jurisdictions with investors' trade arbitration, etc. So do you think this is a type of the globalization 3.0, and I would like to hear your comments on that. Thank you.
Yeah, I think the trend you're mentioning is one that I'm quite worried about and write about in my book. I think, it is these bilateral trade agreements or the free trade agreements, which create, as you say, which carve out, sort of extra-national jurisdictions for foreign investors and so forth, aren't imposed by the United States or Europe. I mean, the developing countries are dying to get into these arrangements. In a way, so the problem isn't necessarily that these powerful countries are imposing these asymmetric arrangements. It's that the developing countries are falling over each other because of you know, if I'm allowed a Marxist term, sort of a false consciousness, if you will, that they have an idea that that these trade agreements can be a shortcut to development. That, you know, you sign these agreements, your risk rating goes up, and you know, you attract a lot of investment, everything goes well. I mean, we've seen time and again these expectations actually not really fulfilled. So I think the problem here, I think, is more at the level of national consciousness, at the level of what it is that developing countries think they're doing, what their growth strategy is, and what kind of a role these trade agreements can play. I think for some kind of countries it may make sense, I think, but in many countries they're sort of using this quite inappropriately, I think, as a shortcut to investment and growth strategies, and I think will be disappointed.
Yes. I would like to ask what is will be the impact on global economical decisions of the new emerging power as China, as India, and aren't the Occidental power undervaluing them?
I mean, clearly we're moving into a world which is becoming much more multi-power, and the center of gravity in terms of power is moving east and south. In particular, the role of China is going to be very important. I think one of the interesting things about the new powers, China, India, Brazil, and so forth, is that even though they're very, very different countries, there's one thing that they share, which is that they're very zealous about guarding national sovereignty. And I think so that tells us that in this kind of a new world regime, the multipolar world regime that we're going to be moving in, you know, the arguments that I've made here in terms of understanding that national sovereignty has value, particularly when it is underpinned by democratic deliberation, that you know, this is going to be willy-nilly going to be part of the global architecture in the new world system that we're moving into. So even if this consciousness doesn't exist intellectually, I think it's going to be forced on us by the constellation of new powers there. So that is also the sense in which the kind of architecture I'm recommending is much more consistent with this shift away from Western Europe and the United States, I think. Now, the flip side of that is that countries like China will have to recognize that if they value their national sovereignty and they want to guard zealously their policy space for their own policies, that they need to understand that as systemic players, that the industrial countries have similar needs as well. So the quid pro quo will have to be that, yes, you can have your policy space, but we need it too. Let's discuss how we can create an interface between those that doesn't spill over and create too adverse negative effects.
So these were all very good and difficult questions. So let me add a couple of easy ones. First, there seemed to me to be a great absentee in your presentation, and I think it's something that people here perhaps are interested in. And these are NGOs. In a way, NGOs prove capable of, in a way, monitoring, following, and addressing some of the issues. We're addressing fair trade by unfair trade by multinational corporations and so on. So I would like to have your views on this, because clearly there is also an issue of political accountability there, which is a very serious one. So that's the first one. And the second, you were saying, rightly so, that sometimes political, economic integration should wait for political integration. But there are clearly dynamic, mechanisms where, to some extent, economic integration can create a condition also for political integration. A standard example comes from your theories about trade, the fact that if you open up to trade, when you uncover, you unfold, you discover your comparative advantages. So then openness to trade becomes something that is more beneficial for the country doing that. There are also cases where things may go wrong. Case of migration you were just mentioning before, and there I'm a bit skeptical about your idea of opening more to labor flows, because we have a history of Europe and other countries that moved from a situation where there was much more mobility of workers to a situation where we closed borders, and we are doing that more. So not only that type of integration does not create the support and the constituency for more political integration, but things. So I wonder whether there is some dynamics there that we are missing.
They were great, easy questions. Let me just say something about the NGOs. I actually do talk in chapter 10 about this. One chapter in the book is devoted to the question of, is global governance really feasible and desirable? And obviously, one of the mechanisms through which you can generate some kind of a global governance, as you suggested, is to rely increasingly on these international NGOs that provide information, that can monitor, have various kinds of accountability mechanisms, perhaps, and so forth. And my conclusion, sort of having looked at this, is that it's a very, very imperfect set of mechanisms, partly because of sort of the informational, it's, let me put it this way, the kind of global market integration that these NGOs and various other similar movements like in corporate social responsibility or the transparency initiatives, the various labeling initiatives and so forth can sustain, I think, is a relatively limited kind of global economic integration. We see this already in a number of different areas. For example, various labeling initiatives or fair trade initiatives turn out to be, when you scratch the surface, turn out to be, in a lot of cases, not more than feel-good initiatives. There are huge problems in terms of accountability. There are huge problems in terms of who gets the information, how is it conveyed, does it actually make a difference in practice. So my general evaluation is, without in the least bit wanting to devalue the work that these NGOs do, in particular in putting very important issues on the agenda, I am somewhat skeptical that they are a large part of the solution. That in some sense we haven't come up with real alternatives to real existing democratic political institutions of the classical type. And the various alternatives to it, whether it is these NGOs and various codes of conduct, or it is various notions of networked governance, that is the other kind of global governance that political scientists have been talking about. I'm sort of skeptical that they can take us very far.
Well, credo che abbia... Beh, qui ci sono ancora...
Well, the last two questions.
Getting back to a country who doesn't love NGO, I'm talking about China, and we were talking about World Trade Organization, but now many people who analyze international economy and policy, they're talking about Beijing consensus. It's not well spread in the world, but it's spreading. So I would like to know about the influence of Beijing consensus. Thank you very much.
The Beijing consensus, I think that it hasn't had, I don't know what the Beijing consensus is. I mean, I see it being mentioned, but I'm not quite sure what it is. I sort of have a sense of what the Chinese did and why they may have been so successful in what they did. I see very little transferability to other countries in terms of its operational implications. I see a lot of transferability in the kind of frame of mind. So I think the pragmatism, the experimental nature of policy, the willingness to put up that guard against the mosquitoes and the bugs. Some of the general principles that has sort of been behind their specific policies, I think those are transferable. But when you talk about the specifics about their, the township and village enterprises or the special economic zones and then various other, their institutional innovations, I don't think they're particularly transferable. So I think what has happened in the last 10, 15 years in terms of growth strategies, development strategies, is that we've moved, the real consensus has been that there's no consensus. And I think the danger is that that sort of leads us to a sort of everything goes kind of an approach. And my view on that has been that it's not that everything goes. There are still some very broad, very important principles that good economic policy satisfies. And it's important to provide property rights to investors. It's important to provide macroeconomic stability. It's important to provide market-oriented incentives. It's important to orient your economy outwards. These are all the kinds of things that are parts of the consensus that you can utter when you get off the plane in a country that you've never been to before. If somebody asks you, what should we do? But if those are in some sense empty of content, because if you say, how are we going to provide market-oriented incentives? How do we get property rights protection? How do we get outward orientation? That's where the details are. And my analysis suggests that those details are highly context-specific and depend very much on local market conditions and local political considerations. And so there you can't have a consensus, really.
L'ultima domanda.
Well, I'm not an expert. I'm an entrepreneur who has suffered a lot because of the crisis. I read in these days in the newspapers that the financial situation has gone back to the pre-crisis situation. We've gone back to pre-2007. So I'd like to understand from you if in 2 years' time we will go back to the bad crisis of 2008, 2009.
Well, you're taking me at my word of the title, The Future, and I was trying to prevent from doing that. I mean, without being too snide about it, I do think that globally, we haven't faced up to the real challenges that the crisis has revealed. I don't think the nature of regulation of financial markets has been substantially and significantly changed and affected in the positive direction, either by way of our domestic regulations or by way of our global arrangements. So I think it's been mostly tinkering. So I don't think it's going to be in 2 years' time, because the cycle tends to be around 10 years. So you have another 8 years, I would say, on the current path. With respect to the European Union, I continue to be optimistic that that the crisis, I think, will elucidate for policymakers this very stark choice that they do face, and that there will be an act of leadership that will be able to move Europe, or at least those members of the Union that want to go in that direction, in a significantly more politically integrated direction. That if that act of leadership takes place, I actually would be more optimistic about Europe's immediate future.
Grazie, so che ci sarebbero tantissime altre domande cui siamo interessati.
I know that there are many other questions from the audience, but so the topic has been very stimulating, and some of these issues will be debated also tomorrow. We will have a lecture in the morning by Ottaviano on free trade, and then there will be a lecture on the crisis and the public deficit by Van Hagen, and then Lucrezia Reichling, who will speak about the new role of central banks. So if you didn't have the opportunity to make questions this evening, you'll have a new opportunity tomorrow. Thank you.